Good evening, everyone, and it's very nice to see you again. So we're at day 2 of EdTech Forum 2020, and we're going to have a very interesting session on space and place of education during the 4th Industrial Revolution times. So to introduce this topic, I would like to introduce the moderator of today's session is Professor Alexander Van de Putte, who is the AIFC Chief Strategy Officer, Chairman of Academic Council, and Chairman of Corporate Governance and Stewardship at the Asna International Financial Center. He is also a Professor of Strategic Foresight at IE Business School. Professor Alexander, can you hear me?
I can hear you and do thank you for the introduction. Ainur, I'm now sharing my slides with you, and welcome to this session, which will take about an hour's time on space and place of education within the 4th Industrial Revolution. Let me start with painting to you a picture of what the 4th Industrial Revolution is, and then afterwards I will also show some of the challenges we face in the current context. Afterwards, I will introduce our panelists, and you will note it's a very diverse group of experts that we have here. And then we will explore together a number of questions using the Davos format. So let me start with the 4th Industrial Revolution. The 4th Industrial Revolution was initially envisioned as the digital ecosystem at the World Economic Forum in 2006. And that also led to a set of scenarios, and that was about the convergence of media and entertainment. And then later on, about 3 years ago, Klaus Schwab wrote a book about it, and Klaus Schwab is the founder of the World Economic Forum. And his definition is, it's the convergence of 3 things: the physical, the digital, and also the biological world. And because it is also the convergence of the biological world, it makes it very distinct from the 3rd Industrial Revolution, which is commonly referred to as the information age. We already see many of the 4th Industrial Revolution technologies around. Some of them have to do with artificial intelligence, yet others have to do with the Internet of Things or additive manufacturing, but also nanotech and biotech are increasingly coming to the fore. But it's not just about tech. It's also about what we see globally in terms of the way that trade is conducted, and also the way that economic gravity continues to accelerate away from the West towards the East. And digital trade is becoming increasingly the norm. If I go back to 2008, the global financial economic crisis, then we saw that both physical trade and global financial flows took a deep dive and have only recovered by 2019 to their 2007 and 2008 peak, respectively. Now, however, digital trade and data flows have continued to grow exponentially despite the global financial economic crisis. And this is today something in the context of a global pandemic, which we continue to see. What we also see in the 4th Industrial Revolution is an increased focus on sustainability and an increased focus on dematerialization. It's because of digital trade has a dramatic potential to focus on dematerialization. Obviously, that is going to have consequences on the kind of skills and jobs that are going to be needed. And this is something that we will explore in this session with our panelists. But given the current context, I need to give justice to how this global pandemic could potentially unfold. When I returned to Kazakhstan, actually from a conference in London, but also from teaching at IE, I was immediately put in lockdown on the 2nd of March. And in conversations with our governor, we then decided that we should look at plausible divergent views of the future. In other words, scenarios about how the global pandemic could unfold, but also what its socio-economic implications were. And yesterday we had two sessions, one that focused exactly on that, and the other one actually focused on disrupt or be disrupted. And George, who's on our panel here today, was yesterday on that second panel. Today, obviously, we will take a deeper dive into what that means for education and especially EdTech. Now, very quickly on the scenarios. We developed three scenarios. One is called managed crises, and that is driven by effective and equitable global cooperation and also efficient government response at the local level and cohesive community resilience. It leads to a deep V-shaped economic recovery, limiting the number of global fatalities, and an economic recovery by the spring of 2021. That's what we would commonly refer to as the most, well, not plausible, but the one that most people would prefer that this global pandemic could unfold. Diametrically opposed, we have Depression 2.0. And that one is driven by patchy government response, selfish community resilience, but also inadequate and uneven global cooperation. It leads to an L-shaped depression, which extends well into 2023. It also has unparalleled humanitarian and economic cost. We don't put probabilities on scenarios, but we do believe, although this scenario is plausible, that it's less likely than any of the two other ones. So what's the third one? The double whammy scenario is actually one that is driven by patchy government response at the local level, selfish community resilience, but effective to a large degree and equitable global cooperation. If you look at the image tells it all. And actually, I mentioned yesterday that my oldest daughter, who is studying psychology, helped me to select this image. And you see these two masks here, they come from Venice. But what do these masks tell you? Is that basically one crisis is masking another crisis. So what does that mean? It's actually it leads to a deep W or even an extended U-shaped economic recovery. And the reason for that is that countries potentially come out of the crisis too early and open up too quickly without having necessarily the policies and procedures in place. And also within society, there is increasingly risk-taking and people deciding for themselves. Now, I think we need to take that context into account as well when we explore actually the question at hand here, or the several questions at hand here, and especially the broader context in which EdTech and education will unfold over the next years and even the coming decade. So let me now introduce our panel of experts, and I've put them excuse me, in alphabetic order. And first of all is Dr. Robert Jenkins, and he joins us from UNICEF, where he is the chief of education. Welcome, Robert. And then we have John Lambrecht, and he's a very different person. He's an entrepreneur. He's actually a serial entrepreneur. He's currently in Malaysia, but he has a company that he founded, and of which he is also the chief executive, and it's called Epitome. And I hope that I pronounced that correctly, Jan. And there's actually a question that we articulated that would directly focus to the expertise that Jan will bring to the fore with his company and the ventures that he has created in the past. And then we have Professor Alison Littlejohn. She is Professor of Learning Tech at University College London, one of the colleges of the University of London, and previously she was with the Open University. Then we have George Littlejohn, our good friend, who has been with us for many years, not as an employee, but as one of our partners with CISI, the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment, a professional body but still a body that focuses on development of people and talent. Now, we also have Professor Eric Schlee, and he joins us from IE University and IE Business School. At IE Business School, he's a professor of marketing, and at IE University, he is University Vice President for Alumni and Careers. Now, also, I have to be transparent about this. Eric recruited me into IE almost 11 years ago, and I'm still pleased and honored to be part of that IE community. And later on today, I will be teaching in Tech Labs, Tech Foresight, for a group of 42, I believe, IMBA students, which is the International MBA. So these are our panelists, and now we have a couple of questions. 3 questions, actually, and the first one has to do with cost, access, but also educational completion. So if we look at, and this is just a trend that we have observed over the years, is that the cost of education has grown much faster than incomes in some countries. And especially, but not limited, of course, to the United States and United Kingdom. Let me just take one example. The Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. That is obviously a business school. An MBA there takes 2 years, not 1 year. And 8 years ago, the cumulative debt of the 420 graduates for the first time exceeded $100 million. In other words, they were starting their careers each with a rucksack on average of debt in excess of $200,000. And they were still starting their career. Obviously, some of them did not have debt, while others had substantially more. So, 2 questions here, and they're interrelated, but obviously, I will ask them to different members of our panel. So the first part is, in your opinion, what is the potential of EdTech to democratize education around the world? And I will start actually here with Robert, and if our panelists are fine with this, I will start using from now on first names. So Robert, Chief of Education at UNICEF, the social dimension of education. Please shed some light on this one for us.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers. Thank you for this opportunity to participate in this very interesting and useful discussion. I'll be brief to recognizing there's a number of panelists, and I look forward to continuing the discussion. But let us all recognize, and building on the introduction, how new technologies are transforming the lives of people across the world in very different ways, depending on the country you live in, depending on your resources and your access. But indeed, it is transformative. Has immense potential, technology, to enable dramatic changes in learning and also in education systems more broadly. And the current pandemic and the impact of the pandemic on children, those of us who have worked in the education sector like the panelists, I think would all agree that we wouldn't have even thought of scenarios such as 1.6 billion children having their education affected due to the pandemic at its peak about a month ago with school closures. Those numbers would have been unheard of or unthought of before. So this pandemic has demonstrated, however, how important technology-enabled learning solutions can be and how they can be rapidly deployed. Now, what is important, though, we recognize that not all children have the same level of access to technology, to networks, to connectivity, etc. So indeed, it also is important for all of us, and particularly in those who in low resource environments, recognize that technology needs to be deployed in a way that it indeed reaches the most marginalized learners and is appropriate for each context. We did see in the response to the pandemic and school closures, the average deployment, countries deployed on average, let me put it this way, countries deployed on average 3.9 different modalities to reach children during remote learning. And a modality meaning all the way from low tech to more high tech. supporting teachers to deliver learning materials, very low tech, no tech, all the way up through the radio, TV to digital solutions, IT enabled, network enabled apps, etc. And so that range is important and needs to be acknowledged in reaching the most marginalized. Also, we need to recognize the equalizing role of EdTech by being able to bring world-class learning and world-class enabled learning outcomes to even the hardest to reach and most marginalized. And we have seen countries very proactive in expanding the network and proactively reaching the most marginalized and having an end result, improving their education outcomes, particularly, and it's critically important when that education content is localized and is relevant to each context. Let me just, before I conclude, make one final point. And that is the importance of a global solidarity or very real partnerships, both at national level, but supporting that national level in all countries with a global movement that draws down resources and expertise from the private sector, from the public sector, content providers, platform providers, network providers. And we have seen that in response to this pandemic in the education sector. And with such solidarity, with such resources harnessed collectively, indeed, we can see a transformative impact on rolling out new technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. And let me now go to Alison. Obviously, Robert, with UNICEF, you don't typically focus at university level, but it's about making education accessible, including to those that don't typically have access to education. And I can imagine that technology provides an enormous lever. Now, Alison, at the University of London, well, University College London, but University of London, many of you may not know this, but is the oldest provider of degree distance learning in the world. So, and actually has provided degree qualifications around the world as well at, let's put it, an affordable price. But also Alison is active as the professor of learning tech. So maybe Alison, for you, both questions, please.
Sure. So the first question about educational technology and the potential to democratize. I think the starting point is there certainly is potential to open up education to a much wider group of people, particularly to those people who don't have access to education. However, it depends on how we do it. We have to start with thinking about the student, because there's a tendency to start with technologies, AI, all of these really exciting things. But if we don't think about learners themselves, then we're not going to be able to democratize. And here's the reason why. The governments recently around the world have tended to focus on metrics and measures with the education sectors. And this is a way to increase accountability for the money spent and so on. But the result of that has been leading to a delivery model where we think about in terms of educational technology. We see there's a lot of move, especially in the past few months during the pandemic. There's been a shift, a pivot, some people call it, to online learning, where we've taken face-to-face methods and we've tried to replicate them online. And this doesn't work very well because online learning is very different. It's pedagogically different, psychologically different to learning face-to-face. And this leads to what we know as a delivery model, where we focus on the number of downloads or the number of clicks and so on. These are things that are easy to measure, but actually they're quite meaningless in terms of whether or not people have learned. Now, the UK Open University is one of the leading online universities in the world, and they produce very high quality, quite expensive, but very, very educationally high quality resources online. However, the real power of studying at the Open University is not really accessing those resources. It's having a personal tutor, an associate lecturer, who will talk with you, give you feedback, give you interaction, enable you to interact with other students, even though you don't meet them. And that's where the learning happens. So if we want to democratize through educational technology, then we have to think about these aspects of learning. And many learners don't have the ability to learn. I know that sounds like a basic, but a lot of people who've not had opportunity to be in education really haven't found what the key parameters are. So things like being able to set goals, being able to pursue those goals, having the persistence, understanding the importance of feedback. So we need to be able to make sure that students are able to learn, and we need to build that into the courses that we develop for them. The people who benefit from some of the early MOOCs that were online through edX, Coursera and other MOOC platforms tended to be people who were already enabled. So I would say if we want to democratize, we really have to rethink how we design learning. Now, if you want me to go on to the second question as well, would you like me to do that?
Yes, please. And also, that's a question I would definitely like to ask Eric, and there's a good reason for that. So, Eric, you can already think a little bit ahead about what I will ask you. But Alison, yes, please do. And it's not just, of course, limited to AI. The question here is really, how do we ensure that people that study remotely also complete their degrees? Because the fallout rate is substantially higher than with face-to-face learning.
Yes, indeed. So we know some of the reasons why fallout rates can be very high. If we point to these massive open online courses, the MOOCs that were first launched by edX, Coursera, FutureLearn and other platforms, and many of these have a high dropout rate, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people are not learning. We have to look at the motivations of learners, what are the reasons for going on the course. And a lot of people actually go on the course just to learn one thing or out of interest. For example, they're not necessarily interested in the qualification itself. So dropout is not necessarily an indicator of non-learning or poor quality courses. However, if the reason why people are taking a course is because they want the qualification and there's a high dropout, then we do have a problem. There's been a lot of research and development over the past decades looking at various analytics and AI-informed systems that will help identify the likelihood of a learner dropping out. And in my own department, which is the UCL Knowledge Lab, it's a centre researching the future of education with technology. We have colleagues there who are developing a number of different systems. But I want to focus at the moment on a system that was developed about 10 years ago by the Open University called OU Analyze. It's an analytics system that looks at all the basically the clickbait data, so all the data that learners generate when they're learning online, and it predicts using predictive analytics whether or not a learner is likely to pass their next assessment. It's a good system in a world where we think of universities almost as learning factories, where students pay to pass through complete assessments and gain certificates. But it's not necessarily a good system to identify whether students are actually learning, because the way that we assess people doesn't necessarily measure whether or not they're learning. So, for example, would you agree to brain surgery from a student that successfully completed an essay on the structure of the brain? So the problem is there's a lot of excitement around the abundance of data that's generated by these systems, and there's a lot of data around. But the question is it the right data? What assumptions do we make when we analyze these data? And do we build algorithms or AI systems that learn from the data that's already in society, and therefore we inadvertently build in the biases that already exist in our society? So we've got to find ways to get over these problems. Better systems are being developed. They tend to be more selective about the kind of data that they measure, and how these data are analysed. They use all kinds of data, not just the clickstream data that was originally used, but they use skin resistance data, for example, that measures the temperature of your skin, facial recognition systems, semantics, whether it's spoken word or written word. And algorithms are now being designed in a much more sophisticated way, not simply by computer scientists, but bringing in the people who will actually use these systems and a range of people from different disciplines.
Okay. Well, one thing that I hear also from Alice, and it's obviously not the only thing, is that it's not just about tech. You referred, for example, to the tutorial system, which is obviously not tech-based, but actually would dramatically enable learning. And you emphasized many times learning versus completing a degree, which obviously is a very different, not necessarily the same. Let me put it this way. Let me go to Eric. IE mantra is reinventing higher education. So it was not just driven by COVID-19. This has been going on for a long period of time already. So Eric, what do we mean by that? And how is, for example, IE using, and maybe other universities as well, because you also organize an EdTech Forum every year at IE, to anticipate performance, but also make sure that students actually learn, but also complete their qualifications that they are enrolled in. Eric, please.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me here. I think the context that I'm most familiar with in higher education, postgraduate programs, MBA programs, we worry less about mass education and worried about students dropping out because you have to select them well in the first place. That's probably more for large undergraduate programs. So to some extent, what is happening with EdTech, what we've been doing for over 20 years in what we call blended education, for example, works beautifully in a wow room format that we've created. It's a physical room with large screens. And we use AI there, for example, to read the mood and the faces of the people. So you have about 40 screens, I think it's 45 screens up there. And there, it's not about anticipating performance or fearing that they drop out, but are they less energetic? Are they about to fall asleep? And there's actually an AI logic built in that will tell the professor who's standing in that room, careful, Jamie over here is about to fall asleep, okay? But this is a very different context from large undergraduate classes when you have 40 in a classroom and it's a very select executive MBA or MBA program, okay? So I think AI for me is actually more interesting in terms of the question of learning speed. Yeah, in terms of how do you manage individual learning speeds, because that's the one thing that we were always constrained with. You're in one classroom, you're more or less going at one speed, but people go at different speeds. And in that sense, I think it could truly revolutionize how each individual's learning journey actually carries out. I love the idea of access and democratizing education, and that's all fantastic. And it probably leads to some degree to an unbundling of the overall value proposition of what we do, at least in some institutions. And that means maybe the new norm driven by AI, right? But I'm thinking of AI much broader than just the two aspects you're putting here, leads to no longer having a 4-year college degree as a standard, right? But maybe having different kind of maybe competency-based programs that you put together, and AI can be absolutely fantastic in basic knowledge transfer. I think this is where we will make professors at some point redundant. If it's just about knowledge transfer, at some point you have to absorb it like a sponge. You have to spit it out at an exam at some point. Tech can do it just fine. What I'm most interested in is and that kind of leads to the second part later, is a bit the AI resistant capabilities that we need to teach students. Where is it where AI isn't able to do it easily? So critical thinking, emotional intelligence, persuasion, these kind of things is not just knowledge transfer. So AI is great and is definitely here to day. And I think from the dropping out part, I'm not as worried about, and the anticipating performance, I'm not that worried either, because in a class of 40, you probably monitor them well anyway.
Indeed. Thank you, Eric. And well, and I recently read a Harvard Business Review article about, you referred to, for example, a 4-year bachelor's degree. And I believe it's Dartmouth College that's considering having, let's say, roughly speaking, 1/3 of the time you will come to campus. And that's typically for the labs where you would need actually, well, either experimentation or interaction that otherwise would not be possible. And then another 1/3 would be synchronous learning, but online. And then yet another 1/3 would be asynchronous. Are these nicely 3/3? I'm not sure, but there's probably a lot of merit in an idea about moving to more hybrid learning, even at the undergraduate level, which is something that is already happening dramatically, especially in business schools, but also in professional schools. But let me now go to the second question, and I will start with Jan. And I'm wary of time because we have 25 minutes left and we have to stop sharply because the room is going to be used for another panel, I was told. So obviously, Jan, I think this is a question that preoccupies you in your current position and as a founder of Epito. So millions of technology jobs are going to be unfilled because we currently don't have necessarily the training and people don't have the competencies. And it's not just the competencies. Eric referred to the ability to persuade, emotional intelligence. These are obviously mindsets that are going to be different than maybe what we need in the third industrial revolution. So I understand that you look at what will these skills and competencies be in the future, and how do you anticipate them? But also, are universities in general well positioned? And I wouldn't say it's necessarily only universities. I will also ask that to George this question for professional bodies to cater to these needs. So it's a dual-pronged question. Jan, please, the word is yours.
Yep. Thank you, and thank you for this invitation. So with Epitome, we are a workforce analytics company. But one of the things that we try to do is we really try to go into the core of the learners, the students, the unemployed, and the people, trying to understand their psychometrics, trying to understand their values, their interests and preferences in life. So we are active globally, but I want to give an example in the ASEAN region. ASEAN region is Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, and 6 other countries, resulting in 650 million people in the region. And we are the 4th or 5th largest economy in the world. And what we found out from our data from undergraduates, graduates, and early job career seekers is that only 21% is in alignment with their career choice. So what does that mean? The government, who is doing workforce planning and who is trying to place their graduates into the jobs, is expecting 100 engineers are coming out of school. But in reality, there is only 21 engineers coming out of school. And to those 21, they know what they studied. They love what they studied, and they really want to do something in a job with it. But the other ones, they're just not clear about what is this study resulting in my real life? How is my job going to be? So this is where the universities will have to start adopting and start with career services, where they really look into the student like, hey, you don't see the benefit of something you have been studying for the last 4 years. You've been studying an engineer because your mom wanted you to become an engineer, or you followed your best friend to school. But you have an enterprising mindset. So you actually could go in enterprise solution selling with your mindset and with your knowledge. So this is then the career services universities will have to adopt and to point out to their students and their graduates to take that next step in life. Either it's an internship, connecting them to content to develop them even more, connect them to a job or to a job or an apprenticeship or an internship, basically. Now, the jobs and the skills of the future, to address the first part, you know, one of the things that we are seeing is those skills and jobs are not being invented by the schools or by the governments or by the agencies or the universities. The jobs and skills of the futures are still being invented by the industry. It's the industry that, because of this pandemic, now really understand what skills do we need to survive the next 3 to 5 years. So I believe that the universities will have to, which they're already doing, working with the private sector, but they have to work even more closer with the private sector so that they can deliver students that have already the skills that they will need in their job. And those skills are not only technical or vocational skills. This is also like teamwork. This is also like communication or intrinsic motivation. Because the sad truth is the only way that how universities are still assessing the students is based on their grades. The only way how the industry, the companies is assessing students is based on their CV. The CV is an instrument that hasn't changed in the last 50, 60, 70 years. How can you see on a CV if somebody is a good team player or a good communicator? So I believe that the universities are well positioned, but they are now going to start taking a different role a little bit. They have to start creating a lifelong learning mindset in all their graduates and students' life, because those students will have to reinvent themselves several times, several careers in their life. So I believe that lifelong learning mindset and mentality that needs to come from the university is going to be the game changer that was started by this pandemic.
I cannot agree more personally, but that's obviously my own mental model, and I don't want to impose my own mental model here. George, you're working for a professional body, and you're a fellow of yet another one. So how do you ensure that the programs you have are not based on the skills that were needed in the past, but really the skills that are needed for the future?
Economics, dear boy, economics. Alexander, thank you very much. I feel very honoured to be invited here. I should, for the sake of transparency, explain that the reason why Alison and I have the same surname is that we are cousins. Alison is the one who got the brains in the family. But when we were young, which in Alison's case was much more recently than in my case, it's fair to say that probably only about 10% of people in Britain, and probably in many other countries, went to university. Now it's roughly half. There was a speech 2 years ago to the Chartered Banker Institute's annual dinner in Edinburgh, in Scotland, where Professor John Kay, one of the most eminent economists in Britain, indeed in the world, said that when he was at school in Edinburgh, the bright boys and girls went to university, and the less bright became bank managers, which I thought was a little rude to an audience consisting entirely of bank managers. But what he meant was that graduates were the people who tore down a lot of very big banks like RBS, like NatWest, like Lloyds. It was the bank managers who'd gone straight from school who were the very effective managers. Now, we as a professional body, very briefly, 30 years old, used to be part of London Stock Exchange. Until about 10 years ago, almost all of our entrants were graduates, because that's what firms employ. There are so many graduates out there, they employ graduates. But then a number of rather forward-looking firms like Barclays, Citi, Societe Generale, Santander, a number of other big names started working with us in this. And we did it particularly in Glasgow, and it's now spread around the world, which is that they realized the sort of skill sets that they needed for the future weren't necessarily driven by graduates, but by a mingling of financial knowledge and skills and an understanding of new technologies, which are completely transforming banking. They were then, and it's even faster now. And what they did was started hiring school leavers, and instead of going to university and building up debts, student loans, as happens in every country, far less than the rucksacks of debt that Alexander spoke about for MBA students in America, but still very substantial debts. A very large cohort in Glasgow, and then in Bournemouth, and then in Birmingham, and then in Gujarat, and in Mumbai and Singapore. A large number of school leavers started joining the big banks, getting our professional qualifications. And to address Alexander's question of how we make sure they're relevant, we, like other professional bodies, have got examination panels of practitioners who look into the exams every year and decide what's up to date and what isn't, and particularly how technology is affecting the jobs that the people doing our exams will take when they fully qualify. And in Glasgow, going back there, the experiment has been hugely successful. There are now probably 6,000 or 7,000 people in full-time employment in the back offices of those big banks doing great jobs, and a number have actually gone on to university in their middle 20s, having saved up the money to do it and live rather a better lifestyle in university than they might do otherwise. It's spread to other professions. The accountants, for instance, all the big 4 accounting firms in Britain, which used to hire people like me straight from university with barely an interview. You were lucky if they spent 10 minutes with you. They just gave you a job if you wanted one. Not much money, but you got the job and you got the training. Nowadays, they realize that they might be better off employing students straight from school, sending them on what we used to call sandwich courses at universities. So in other words, short-term 3, 6, 9-month programs, and ending up with skilled professionals with qualifications that could be amended as the technology changes. And I think that's key to this whole thing, that the technologies are changing so fast. AI, even artificial intelligence, even 2 years ago, certainly 3 years ago, was something in the future. Nowadays, if someone asks, what are you using by way of AI in your office, almost everyone in the financial services industry can say that, and that. Every day when I come in or when I book in online, we're using AI. So school leavers, I think, should be a big focus for the future for all of us in Kazakhstan, east of Kazakhstan, and here in Britain.
Mm-hmm.
I'll finish there, Alexander, sorry.
All right, thank you. And let me now go to Eric, and then I'll move on to the next question. For the next question, I will call upon everybody. So, Eric, you now VP Alumni and Careers. So how do you link back what you learn from the employers, but also from the alumni, potentially back to the curriculum to make sure that the curriculum is much more relevant? Is that something you focus on at IE?
I think we absolutely have to. And there's been one approach that seems simple, but is, I think, powerful at the end that we've been using. And so it was typically you design curricula because of traditions in certain academic disciplines and so forth. And we went the other way around. We worked backwards and we said, what are the hot jobs? I think I heard from Jan earlier, you mentioned I think it was an enterprise solutions architect, okay? That is a hot job that didn't exist, I would say 5 years ago, certainly not 10 years ago. So we did a whole list of the hot jobs. We then listed the skills that were needed to do these hot jobs, to actually be competitive in the market and be hired. And then we designed programs around those skills, and so that students would be able to develop them and hone them over a 1-year master. So that's one approach. And that has a huge caveat. It only actually works when faculty does not have major resistance to change, and they actually go along with you. So that's one thing we were doing. And the thing, of course, on the pure career side is to open up, to show them totally different pathways that they might not be aware of in terms of what they could pursue.
Lovely, thank you. And well, and in Switzerland, interestingly, and in Germany as well, and that's more for technical skills, is that many companies like Siemens, they have their own technical vocational schools. But in Switzerland, for example, there was a time that bankers did not need to have a degree. They were trained within the financial institution, and after 4 or 5 years, they had at least the equivalent through the apprenticeship of a bachelor's degree, or probably even more advanced, but directly relevant and state-of-the-art based on what the industry was asking for. Now, COVID-19, we briefly talked about that. And then the question is, will there be an enduring shift towards hybrid, or what some call liquid model of learning and development? And I would like to start with Alison, and I would like to ask everybody 1 minute. We're running out of time, unfortunately. So I will start with Alison, then with Eric again. Then we'll go to George, Jan, and Robert. 1 minute each. Alison, please. Thank you.
I think we'll certainly see a difference in terms of what universities offer and what education looks like post-COVID-19, but some of the differences might not be quite what we imagine. We will see an increased use of technology for learning, but I think the back end of education is likely to change even more. So the way that academics, for example, design courses, the time spent up front doing that design, the promotions criteria, all of these have to change if we're going to be successful. This is one of the things that we're working on at UCL in London.
Thank you. I believe Eric. Yes, Eric.
I mean, the term liquid and liquid learning has been all over ever since COVID hit us. And I think it was a way of being, COVID-19 was a catalyst that pushed us kind of to go to the next level, because we had been toying with blended learning for 20 years, as I mentioned before. And the phrase we used internally was, we moved education 2.0 from the pantry back into the kitchen and literally started cooking on a daily basis of how we could lift it to the next level. The challenge was that when actually we flipped the switch, as everybody else had to online, is that the full-time students didn't sign up for online, right? So it was more of an expectations problem. But what we're now developing mostly for the fall very thoroughly is that liquid idea of that the lives we've been living since March have been liquid in terms of virtual, in terms of reality that you live, in terms of your environment around you. And that will stay. So in fact, we're preparing all of the classrooms for September to be able to incorporate both an online audience together with a face-to-face audience that sits in the classroom, and they will be able to talk to each other, they will be able to hear each other, and so forth. So that's one thing. EdTech is here to stay, and the one thing that we haven't touched on is certificate programs independently of degrees, and I believe that for those specialized skills that we discussed earlier are definitely going to go up, and not necessarily by traditional higher education institutions, but possibly other players.
Lovely, thank you. George, from a professional body perspective?
You know, this event itself is a very interesting example of how things have slightly improved during COVID. While I would much prefer to have been in Nur Sultan right now, as I was for this same event 2 years ago, you have gathered together, Alexander, with Yanur, this terrific group of people, I don't include myself in that, who would not have been able physically, probably half of us would have got to Nur Sultan, if that. We've found in our professional work that we can get many better speakers, much more serious speakers, to speak to our students during our base level exams than we've ever been able to get before, simply because we can get them to do a half-hour talk, people from the highest end of the industry, a half-hour talk, which they probably couldn't have got into the diaries this year. They're happy to do it, so there may be a silver cloud, a silver lining to this rather nasty cloud by getting much more serious speakers than we could in the past.
Well, and I tried to get Eric over a few times already, but it wasn't possible. But now that we're using this tech, we can actually do it. Yes, thank you, George. And Jan, please.
Yeah, so how we see it, and you know, we're helping entire countries and agencies and school groups, and what a few months ago was a nice to have, home-based learning, being ready online, and it was a nice.
Allow me to briefly interrupt you, because there's another thought that you give me. Will a hybrid learning or a liquid model of learning help you to have faster feedback loops to the skills that are needed? And
yeah,
sorry about throwing that in there at the last minute.
Yeah, no, but that it's 100% sure. You know, yeah, EdTech has been here already for 20 years. EdTech has been already combining the best tech with the best content, with the best teachers, and trying to bring it at mass. There is some really successful examples there like Coursera and all that, but in the end today their completion rate is extremely low, and the impact they're creating for your next job or your next step in life is kind of nihil. Today, what would have been 6 months ago a nice to have, an online platform and hybrid learning, etc., is today a must have. So now countries are really looking into it, because it's proven no matter what, you know, like we did it. We moved entire countries online. We impacted, I believe, you said it, Alexander, in the beginning, 1.6 billion children in it. So it's here to stay. But I do believe that we now really have to look into the fundamentals. We have to assess individuals based on their learning style, their learning path. We have to find out their motivation, because motivation has a direct correlation to performance at work. So we have to look more at analytics and not just at grades. So we really have to look into the analytics, and then we can build anything on top of that.
Fantastic. Robert, is it here to stay, especially if you look at your audience at UNICEF, the one that you catered for?
It is indeed here to stay, and I know we're running out of time. I'll just summarize by saying I think we now have, as other speakers have mentioned, a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reimagine better education systems, ensuring it reaches the most vulnerable children and youth throughout the world. Thanks for this opportunity.
Thank you all. Indeed, we're running out of time. We could have continued easily 30 minutes more. You were a lovely, this is the British way of saying it, you were a lovely panel, and it was an honor to moderate this session. Thank you so much, and look forward to being in touch soon with all of you.
Thank you, Alexander.
Thank you, Alexander. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everybody.
It's a wonderful new city, isn't it? 20 years old today, and it's grown immensely fast. It's got wonderful world-class buildings in it, and the imaginative nature of this particular center is fantastic.
And I've watched Astana grow into being one of the most interesting, modern, important cities in the region. And I'm very happy to be here today.
I believe Astana, it will be an important hub, you know, for financial-wise in the world.
It's fascinating to see Astana working to establish itself as a significant player in the new economy.
Я в восторге, мне действительно очень нравится. Я удивлен, что в стране практически везде можно рассчитаться без контактной карты. Большие усилия по озеленению, поэтому прекрасно.
I feel there's a very high level of energy among the Kazakhs. I feel that Kazakh is at the inflection point where they're going to jump many levels in terms of their economic and financial development.
Люблю Казахстан, это прекрасный народ, и каждое пребывание для меня в Астану – это праздник.
All the very best. Listen, you have done in Kazakhstan things that are unbelievable. The creation of Astana 20 years ago, nobody believed that after 20 years it will be such a vibrant, strong city. So therefore, the beginning of the AIFC, I very much hope will have the same success in a few years.
МФЦ предоставляет услуги ведущих судей, а также надежные законы и невероятную инфраструктуру. Вкратце, МФЦ – это идеальная экосистема для инвесторов. Любой, кто хочет инвестировать в Казахстан и регион в целом, не может сделать это лучше, чем через Международный финансовый центр Астана. Вы являетесь инвесторами, выбор стоит за вами. Вы хотите инвестировать в эту страну через МФЦ? Добро пожаловать. Вы хотите инвестировать в эту страну другим способом? Пожалуйста. Мы даем вам возможность, мы даем вам форум, мы предоставляем вам выбор. Настало время воспользоваться этим преимуществом и инвестировать в Казахстан. Казахстан приветствует вас. В дальнейшем мне бы хотелось видеть усердную работу и продуманное планирование, которое уже происходит в целях развития институтов. Я хочу поздравить МФЦ за все, чего они достигли за такой короткий промежуток времени, а именно качество привлеченных экспертов, энтузиазм команды и их активная вовлеченность. Я считаю удивительным подобные достижения предложения за такой короткий период времени. Я желаю им дальнейшего успеха и от имени LexisNexis с нетерпением ожидаю сотрудничества с Академией МФЦА и МФЦА в целом. Наше сотрудничество обеспечит привлекательные возможности инвестирования и поможет казахстанским юристам установить контакт с мировым сообществом.